Billionaire Bet $200 a black waitress can't speak Japanese. Her reply makes the whole room stand up. The night was supposed to be perfect. A private dinner, 40 floors above Chicago. The kind of restaurant where the menu had no prices because if you had to ask, you couldn't afford to be there. Crystal glasses, candlelight that made everyone look important. And at the center of it all, Richard Cole, billionaire, dealmaker, the kind of man who walked into rooms and made other men sit up straighter without saying a word. He had just closed what his team called the deal of the decade. $55 million, Pacific Rim expansion, years in the making. Tonight was the celebration. But Richard Cole had a habit, an ugly, expensive habit that people around him had learned to ignore. He liked to make people feel small. And tonight, he chose the wrong person. She was just doing her job. Moving quietly between tables, tray balanced perfectly, dark uniform pressed clean. Maya, 28 years old, natural hair pinned back, eyes that gave nothing away. She set his glass down without a word. That's when Richard leaned back in his chair, looked around at the powerful men seated at his table, and smiled the smile of someone who had never once been told no in his life. "Gentlemen," he said, loud
Gentlemen, I'll make tonight even more interesting.
enough for the whole room to hear, "I'll make tonight even more interesting." He reached into his jacket, pulled out a check, slid it to the center of the table like it was a playing card. $200,000, says this girl, right here, cannot speak a single sentence of Japanese. The table laughed. Maya didn't move. But what none of them knew, not Richard, not his guests, not even the man quietly watching from the corner of the room, was that this moment was already over. Richard Cole just didn't know it yet. Stay with me, because what happens next in this room will change everything you think you know about power, pride, and the people we choose to overlook. Where are you watching from tonight? I would like to connect with you better. Take a moment to like and click the subscribe button. To understand what happened in that room on the 40th floor, you have to understand two things. Who Richard Cole was, and who Maya Chen was. Because this was never just a bet. This was two entire lives, built in opposite directions, finally colliding in the same room on the same night. And only one of them was ready for it. Richard Cole had not always been rich. That was the part he never told anyone. The part he had spent 40 years and several $100 million trying to bury so deep that even he sometimes forgot it was true. He grew up in Southside Cleveland. Shared bedroom. Single mother. Shoes that didn't quite fit. He remembered as a boy watching men in suits walk past him on the street, the way they moved, the way the world seemed to part for them, and making himself a promise so fierce it became the foundation of everything he would ever do. I will never be invisible again. And he kept that promise. By 30, he had built his first company from a 2-room office and a loan he wasn't sure he could repay. By 40, he had sold it for more money than his entire neighborhood had ever seen in one place. By 55, Richard Cole was the kind of name that appeared in headlines, not because he sought attention, but because money at a certain level stops being private. He had properties in 6 states, a penthouse in Manhattan, a standing reservation at restaurants that didn't take reservations. He collected things, art, cars, contracts, companies. He collected people too, in his way. Surrounded himself with those who agreed with him, laughed at his jokes, and never, ever made him feel small. Because feeling small was the one thing Richard Cole could not survive. And that was his flaw. The crack in the foundation. The thing that all his money had never been able to fix. He did not respect people who worked with their hands. He did not see waitstaff or cleaners or drivers as people with interior lives. They were furniture to him. Functional, replaceable, beneath his notice. And when something or someone reminded him that the world did not actually revolve around him, his reaction was not embarrassment. It was cruelty. Maya Chen had grown up between 2 worlds and belonged completely to both. Her mother, Dr. Linda Foster, was a literature professor at Emory University in Atlanta. Sharp, elegant, the kind of woman who quoted Toni Morrison at the breakfast table and meant every word. Her father, James Aoki, was a Japanese-American architect whose firm had quietly shaped the structural bones of buildings across 3 continents. He was not loud about his success. He never had been. James had met Linda at an academic conference in San Francisco. She was presenting a paper on narrative identity. He was there for an architecture symposium one floor below. They had reached for the same coffee at the same moment. The rest, as Maya liked to say, was inevitable. Maya was their only child, and she was, from the very beginning, both of them at once. She had her mother's sharpness, the ability to read a room, to hear what wasn't being said, to find the story buried inside the silence. And she had her father's stillness, that deep, unshakable calm that came from a man who had learned that the loudest person in the room was rarely the most powerful. She had spent ages 6 through 10 in Kyoto, following her father as he oversaw a decade-long restoration project for a historic district near Gion. She learned Japanese the way children learn languages, not from textbooks but from life, from neighbors, from the woman at the tofu shop who taught her how to count change, from her father's colleagues who forgot sometimes that the quiet little girl in the corner was listening to every word. By the time she was 10, she dreamed in Japanese. By the time she returned to Atlanta at 16, she was fluent in a way that made native speakers stop and ask which prefecture she was from. She went to Georgetown, studied international relations, graduated with honors, turned down 2 corporate offers because she wasn't ready, because she wanted, she told her mother, to learn how people actually live before I start making decisions that affect them. Which was how, at 28 years old, with a Georgetown degree and 4 languages in her head, Maya Chen found herself working as a waitress at Altitude, one of Chicago's most exclusive rooftop restaurants. Saving money to fund her graduate applications while quietly learning the restaurant business from the inside. She liked the work, liked the movement of it, the precision, liked watching people when they didn't think anyone was watching them. A table of 6 could tell you everything about human nature if you knew how to look. She had seen men like Richard Cole before, many times. She knew exactly what they were. The private dining room at Altitude could seat 30. Tonight, it held 22. All of them Richard's guests, his investors, his associates. The kind of crowd that validated each other simply by being in the same room. Maya had been assigned to the table alone. A test from the floor manager who had watched her work for 3 months and trusted her with the difficult ones. She moved through the early courses without incident. Precise. Invisible in the way good service always is. Present without being noticed, attentive without being intrusive. She had noticed Richard the moment she walked in. The way he held the room, the way his voice was always 3 decibels louder than necessary. The way he looked through her, not at her, every time she approached the table. She had said nothing. She had simply done her job. And then came the moment with the check. The $200,000 challenge laid flat on the white tablecloth like a dare. And every single person in that room turned to look at the waitress holding an empty tray, waiting to see if she would crumble. What they didn't see was the man in the far corner of the room, quiet, still, watching everything, slowly set down his glass. Nobody had properly introduced him tonight. That had been the point. The laughter hadn't fully died down yet. It hung in the air of the private dining room like smoke. Rich, self-satisfied, the kind of laughter that wasn't really about humor at all. It was about power. About 22 people in expensive clothes watching one person in a uniform and deciding, collectively, that the distance between them was funny. Richard Cole was still smiling, still leaning back in his chair with the ease of a man who had never once lost a room. He tapped the check with 2 fingers. "Well?" he said, looking at Maya with the patient amusement of someone who already knew the outcome. "I'm a generous man. Take your shot." A few of the guests shifted in their seats. One woman, Claire Hendricks, a tech investor seated 3 chairs from Richard, looked down at her plate, not laughing, but not saying anything either. That was the thing about rooms like this. Everyone always had a reason to stay quiet. Maya stood still for exactly 3 seconds. Not because she was nervous, but because she was deciding something, not whether to respond, but how. She had learned from years of watching her father navigate rooms full of men who underestimated him, that the most powerful thing a person could do in a moment of public humiliation was refuse to be humiliated. Not with anger, not with tears, with absolute, unshakable composure. She set her tray down on the service station beside her, folded her hands in front of her, and looked at Richard Cole with an expression so calm it was almost unnerving. "I'm sorry, sir," she said. "Could you repeat the terms?" Richard blinked. He hadn't expected that. "The terms," he repeated, enjoying himself now. $200,000 says you cannot speak one sentence, one in Japanese. Conversational, real, not Google Translate. He looked around the table for approval. "Got it," in the form of grins and nodding heads. "And if I can?" Maya asked. Richard's smile widened. "Then I write you a check right now, in front of everyone. And if I can't? Then you smile, refill my glass, and we all have a good story to tell." More laughter, looser now, emboldened. Maya nodded slowly. "I understand. I figured you might not want to try," Richard added, tilting his head with theatrical sympathy. "No shame in it, sweetheart. Not everyone has had the same opportunities." And there it was, not just arrogance, something sharper. The kind of comment designed to remind her, in front of everyone, exactly where he thought she stood. Below him, outside the circle, a woman in a uniform who should be grateful to be in the same room. Claire Hendricks set her fork down. The man in the corner, still nameless to everyone in the room, went very still. But Richard wasn't finished, because men like Richard Cole never knew when to stop. That was always their undoing. Not the first insult, but the third, the fourth, the one that crossed the invisible line. They could never see until they were already past it. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced a second item, his phone. Pulled up a translation app, slid it across the table toward Maya like he was doing her a favor. "Here," he said. "I'll even give you a head start. Pick something simple. Good evening. Thank you. Whatever you like." The table tittered. "Richard," one of the men began. "I'm being generous, David," Richard cut him off smoothly, not even looking at him. "She's got a real shot at $200,000 right now. That's more than she'll make here in 3 years." He looked back at Maya. No pressure. Maya looked at the phone on the table, then back at Richard. And something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. Not anger, not hurt, something quieter than both. Recognition. She had met this man 100 times in 100 different rooms. Different names, different suits, same architecture of cruelty. The need to shrink other people to feel large. The hunger for an audience. The complete and total inability to imagine that the person standing across from him might contain a universe he knew nothing about. She picked up her tray. "I'll need just a moment, sir," she said evenly. "I have another table." Richard leaned back, spreading his arms wide. "By all means, we're not going anywhere." She walked away from the table with her spine straight and her face composed. And the moment she disappeared through the service door, the room exhaled, and the laughter returned. Louder now, more comfortable, the way cruelty always gets louder when its subject has left the room. "Where do you even find people like that?" Someone muttered. "She's not bad looking, though." Another voice offered. "Shame she's just a waitress," Richard said, refilling his own glass. "Could have done something with herself." In the kitchen, Maya stood at the steel counter for exactly 90 seconds. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't crying. She was doing what she always did when the world showed her its worst angle. She was breathing. The way her father had taught her. Slow, even. In through the nose, out through the mouth. "You okay?" whispered Darnell, the sous chef, watching her from across the prep station. "I'm fine," she said. "You don't have to go back out there." She looked at him. Then, almost to herself, she smiled. Small, private. The smile of someone who has just made a decision. "Yes," she said quietly, picking up her tray. "I really do." She pushed back through the service door, walked the length of the room, stopped at Richard Cole's table, set the tray down, looked Richard Cole directly in the eyes for the first time all evening. And in the far corner of the room, the nameless man leaned forward in his chair, just slightly, and for the first time all night, he smiled. Because what was about to happen had already been set in motion long before Maya walked into this restaurant tonight. Long before Richard Cole wrote that check. Long before any of them sat down to dinner. Some traps, after all, are not sprung by the hunter. They are sprung by the prey. The room had settled back into itself, glasses refilled, conversations resumed. The low hum of self-important small talk filling the candlelit space like background music nobody had chosen, but everyone had agreed to. Richard Cole was holding court at the head of the table, recounting some story about a golf game in Scottsdale, a senator, a lost bet, and the men around him were laughing on cue, the way men always laugh around money. Nobody was paying attention to the waitress anymore. That was exactly what Maya needed. She approached the table from the left side, Richard's blind spot, and began clearing the appetizer plates with the quiet efficiency that had made her the floor manager's most trusted server. Methodical, unhurried. She moved around the table like water moving around stone. And then she stopped, behind Richard's chair. Close enough that when she spoke, the words landed in the space between private and public, loud enough for the table to hear, quiet enough to feel intimate. "Sir," she said. Richard didn't look up immediately, finished his sentence first. "And that's when I told the senator, if you can't hold a putter, you can't hold a constituency." Let the laughter crest, then turned his head toward her with the lazy attention of a man who considered being interrupted a form of tribute. "Ah," he said, "she's back." He looked around the table, spreading his hands like a showman. "Ladies and gentlemen, our contestant." More laughter. Claire Hendricks did not laugh. She watched Maya with an expression that was difficult to read, something between guilt and anticipation. Richard reached for the check still sitting at the center of the table, held it up between two fingers like a prop. "So," he said, "have we made a decision?" Maya looked at him steadily. "Hi," she said. The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. "Yes." Richard's smile flickered, just for a second, then returned, wider, more performative. "That's one word, sweetheart. I said a sentence." "I know," Maya said. "I was answering your question." A beat of silence. Then she straightened, clasped her hands in front of her. And when she spoke again, her voice was different. Not louder, not harder, but deeper somehow, carrying the particular authority of someone who has stopped performing and started simply being. "Kono table de ivan ni yo chiranai wa osoraku ana da to omoimasu." Translation: the least mannered person at this table is probably you. She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. Then mo sore wa flash dake no mi ni shite okimasu. Tut, but I'll keep that just between us. The silence that followed was unlike any silence the room had produced all evening. Not the polite silence of people waiting for a punchline, not the uncomfortable silence of people unsure whether to laugh. This was the silence of 22 people suddenly, collectively, realizing that something had just happened that they did not fully understand, and that their not understanding it was itself part of the point. Richard Cole stared at her. His mouth was open slightly. Not in shock, not yet, but in the particular blankness of a man whose script had just been ripped from his hands mid-scene and who had not yet located his next line. What did she said? Was that actually? Voices overlapping, confused, reaching. And then, from the far corner of the room, a sound cut through all of it. Laughter. Not the performed social laughter of the dinner table, real laughter. Deep and genuine and completely unself-conscious, the kind that comes from a place of pure, unguarded delight. Every head in the room turned. The man in the corner, who had sat through the entire evening without introducing himself, without drawing attention, without contributing a single word to the performance Richard Cole had been staging all night, was laughing. He was Japanese, late 50s, silver at his temples, a dark suit so understated it read as deliberate, and his eyes, now fixed on Maya, were bright with something that looked almost like pride. Kenji Watanabe, he stood, addressed Maya directly, in Japanese. Fluid, natural, the cadence of a man speaking his first language in a room where he had been required all evening to use his second. Dochira ni osumai deshita ka? That's Kansai dialect. Where did you live? Maya turned to face him fully, and for the first time all evening, something moved behind her eyes. Not surprise, but recognition. She knew exactly who this man was. Had known the moment she'd first seen him seated in the corner, nursing a glass of water while everyone else also ordered scotch. She had simply been waiting to see if he would speak. Kinto ava ni, fu no shuko no kannen, she replied with a small bow of her head. Translation: Kyoto and Osaka. 7 years for my father's work. Ofusama no onamhai wa? Kenji asked. His voice had changed, quieter now, more careful. Translation, and your father's name? Maya held his gaze. Aoki James. The name landed differently than any word spoken in that room all night. Kenji Watanabe went very still. The laughter was completely gone now. In its place, something electric. The invisible current that moves through a room when the architecture of power has just silently, irrevocably rearranged itself, and no one quite knows yet how to stand in the new configuration. Richard Cole looked between them. Maya. Kenji. Maya again. What's happening? He said, trying for casual, missing badly. Nobody answered him. Kenji crossed the room slowly, stopped in front of Maya, and then he did something that made the entire table hold its breath. He bowed. Not deeply, not extravagantly, but deliberately. The bow of one person communicating to another in front of witnesses that they are seen, that they are known, that they matter. Maya returned it. Anata no fusama ni wahe mo suanaimashita. Kenji said softly. Translation. I owe your father a great deal. Fu mo soyitemasu. Translation. He says the same about you. Richard pushed back his chair. The legs scraped loud against the floor, an ugly sound in the new quiet of the room. Kenji, he said, louder than he intended. You know her? Kenji turned to look at Richard Cole for a long moment. When he finally spoke, he did so in English, slowly, clearly, so that every single person in the room could follow every single word. Richard, he said, I think it is time we had a conversation. But first, he turned back to the table, to the check still sitting at the center of it. He picked it up, looked at it, then placed it carefully in Maya's hand. I believe this belongs to her. Richard Cole opened his mouth, and for the first time in longer than anyone at that table could remember, Richard Cole said nothing. From across the room, Claire Hendricks reached for her glass, set it back down without drinking, and very quietly, almost to herself, she said, Well, it's about time. If you're still with me right now, you already know this story isn't over. The check was just the beginning. What Kenji says next to Richard Cole in that room will cost that man everything he spent his whole life building. Share this video right now, and stay with me for the ending. You won't see it coming. The room had stopped pretending. No more side conversations, no more refilled glasses, no more performance of casual indifference from men who were paid to appear unbothered by everything. 22 people sat in complete, undivided attention. The kind of attention that only arrives when something real is happening, and everyone in the room knows it. Richard Cole was still standing. He had pushed back his chair with that ugly scrape of legs against floor, and now he stood at the head of his own table. His table, his dinner, his celebration. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not know what to do with his hands. He put them in his pockets. Took them out, reached for his glass. Thought better of it. Kenji, he said again, trying to locate the version of his voice that commanded rooms, finding it slightly out of reach. I don't understand this is clearly a coincidence. It is not a coincidence, Kenji said. Simple. Flat. The three most devastating words Richard Cole had heard in 40 years of business. Kenji moved to the empty chair beside Claire Hendricks, not his corner seat but the table itself, and sat down with the unhurried ease of a man who understood that the most powerful thing he could do right now was be still. He folded his hands on the tablecloth, looked at Richard. Sit down, Richard. It was not a request. Richard sat. 8 months ago, Kenji began, his voice measured and quiet. You came to me with a proposal, Pacific Rim expansion, distribution infrastructure. A partnership that would take your company into markets you could not access alone. He paused. Let the room absorb the geography of what he was describing. I was interested. Your numbers were strong, your team was competent, but numbers and competence are not enough, not for the kind of partnership you were proposing. Not for something that would carry my family's name alongside yours. He glanced briefly at Maya, who had not moved from where she stood, tray in hand, back straight, watching. So I asked someone I trust, someone whose judgment I have relied on for over 30 years, to help me understand what kind of man Richard Cole really was. Richard's eyes moved slowly to Maya, then back to Kenji. Something was assembling itself in his expression, not yet understanding, but the terrible, pre-understanding feeling of a man who is beginning to see the shape of what he has done. James Aoki, Richard said slowly. The name tasted different in his mouth now. James Oki, Kenji confirmed. My oldest colleague, my most trusted advisor, and Maya's father. The silence stretched. James told me something interesting when I called him last month, Kenji continued. He said, Kenji, I cannot tell you whether Richard Cole is a good businessman, but I can tell you whether he is a good man, and I know exactly how to find out. He let that land. Maya has worked in 3 of the finest restaurants in this country over the past 2 years. Not because she needed the money, but because her father asked her to. Because James Aoki believed that how a powerful man treats a waitress tells you everything about his character that a boardroom never will. Richard Cole's face had gone the color of old ash. She was never just a waitress, Kenji said. She was the test. The room erupted, not in laughter this time, but in the kind of stunned, overlapping murmur that fills a space when the ground has shifted beneath everyone's feet simultaneously. Chairs shifted. Glasses clinked unintentionally. Someone said, "My God," under their breath, and meant it. Richard turned to look at Maya, really look at her, perhaps for the first time all evening, and what he saw there was worse than anger. She wasn't gloating, wasn't performing triumph. She was simply standing in the same posture she had held all night, composed, present, utterly unbothered, and the very fact of her composure in this moment was the most damning thing in the room. You, Richard started. I brought your dinner, sir, Maya said quietly. You made it into something else. Richard turned back to Kenji, and now something shifted in him. The first stages of a man moving from shock into damage control, that instinctive billionaire reflex of reaching for leverage even when the hand is empty. Kenji, listen, whatever James told you, whatever this was supposed to prove, I was joking. It was a dinner, it was a bit of fun, nobody was actually. 200,000, Kenji said. Richard stopped. You put $200,000 on the table to humiliate a woman you believed had no recourse, Kenji said. That is not a joke, that is a portrait. He stood, and when Kenji Watanabe stood, the room stood with him. In the sense that every spine in every chair straightened involuntarily, the way they do when authority that doesn't need to announce itself finally decides to move. I came here tonight prepared to sign, Kenji said. The contracts were drafted. My legal team was on standby. The $55 million partnership, everything you have worked toward for the past 8 months, was ready to be finalized tonight. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, produced a folded document, laid it on the table in front of Richard. Richard reached for it. Don't, Kenji said. Richard's hand stopped. That is not for you to sign, Kenji said. That is for you to keep, so that every time you consider how you treat the people who serve you, you remember exactly what it cost. He buttoned his jacket. The partnership is withdrawn, Richard. Effective tonight. The sound Richard Cole made was not a word. It was the sound of a man trying to locate language for something. Language wasn't built to carry. 8 months, 40 meetings, 17 flights, 3 restructured proposals. An entire wing of his company reorganized in anticipation of this deal. Gone. Not lost in negotiation, not outmaneuvered by a competitor, not undone by market forces or regulatory shifts or any of the clean, impersonal mechanisms by which business deals ordinarily collapse. Undone by a check he'd laid on dinner day to make a waitress feel small. Kenji. His voice broke slightly on the second syllable. You can't, this is $55 million. You can't walk away from $55 million over a... I just did. Kenji said simply. He turned to Claire Hendricks. Claire, I believe we have a breakfast meeting tomorrow that is now worth discussing more seriously. Claire Hendricks looked up at him. Then, slowly, deliberately, she smiled. I'll have my team call yours tonight, she said. Richard watched this exchange with the hollow eyes of a man watching his future reorganize itself around him, efficiently and entirely without his input. Maya was almost at the door when Richard spoke again. Not loud. Not performing, no audience address, no theatrical delivery, just a man's voice, stripped of everything it used to hide behind, speaking into the space between them. Wait. She stopped, did not turn immediately. Please, he added. She turned. Richard Cole looked, in this moment, like a man who had just seen himself clearly for the first time in decades, and found the reflection deeply, unexpectedly painful. The arrogance was gone. What remained beneath it was something older and more complicated, something almost human. "I owe you an apology," he said. The room was very quiet. "Not because of the deal," he continued, and to his credit, his voice held steady on this. "Not because of Kenji or your father or any of this. I owe you an apology because of what I did, because I looked at you and decided you weren't worth looking at properly. And I was wrong." Maya studied him for a long moment. The room held its breath. "Mr. Cole," she said finally, her voice carrying no heat, no coldness, just the clean clarity of someone who has always known exactly who they are. "An apology I'll accept. A lesson I hope you keep." She picked up the check from where Kenji had placed it in her hand, held it up briefly, then placed it face down on the table beside his glass. "Give it to someone who needs it," she said. "There are plenty of people in the city who do." She picked up her tray, walked to the exit, paused, one hand on the door frame, not looking back, and spoke one final time softly in the language that had started all of this. "Okiyotsukete, Kordo-san. Take care of yourself." And she walked out. The room stayed silent for a long time after the door closed. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the table, a single pair of hands began to clap. Claire Hendricks. Slow, deliberate. Her eyes on the door Maya had just walked through. One by one, the room joined her. Not the nervous, coerced applause of people following a social cue. Something more honest than that. The applause of people who had just witnessed something they had not expected to witness tonight and were responding to it the only way the moment allowed. Richard Cole sat at the head of his table, surrounded by standing people, staring at the folded contract in front of him. $55 million of everything he had worked toward, and the face-down check beside his glass. He did not stand, he did not clap. He simply sat there, in the specific, clarifying silence of a man who has just been handed the most expensive education of his life. 3 months later, the story came out. Not from Maya, not from Kenji. From one of the 22 guests, Claire Hendricks, in an interview about ethical leadership, mentioned it obliquely. A dinner she'd attended. A waitress, a billionaire. A $200,000 bet that cost the man everything. The internet did the rest. Maya Chen became, briefly and against her wishes, famous. She declined every interview request. She didn't post about it. She went back to her graduate applications, submitted them on a Tuesday morning with a cup of green tea and no fanfare, and got accepted to her first choice program, International Relations with a focus on Pacific economic policy, the following spring. Her father called when he heard. "I'm proud of you," James Aoki said, "not for what happened at the dinner. For how you handled it." "I just did my job, Dad," she said. "That," he replied, "is exactly what I mean." Richard Cole's Pacific Rim ambitions did not recover. Without Watanabe International's infrastructure, the project stalled, then contracted, then was quietly dismantled by his board over the following fiscal year. He was not removed. He was not publicly disgraced. He simply became, in the way of men whose worst qualities finally catch up to their consequences, smaller. Not poor. Not ruined. Just smaller. Which, for a man who had built his entire life around never being invisible again, was perhaps the most fitting outcome of all. The $200,000 check was cashed 6 weeks later. Not by Maya. By the foundation she set up in her mother's name, a scholarship fund for first-generation college students in Atlanta. The inaugural class was 12 young women. Every single one of them was exactly the kind of person Richard Cole would have looked through without seeing, because real power was never about how much money you could put on a table. It was always about who you were when you thought nobody important was watching. Maya Chen already knew that. It just took Richard Cole $55 million to learn it.